Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and 2 more Norway shows this week. And then next week, we begin our War Crimes series, but we also got some chats with John McManus and other people coming up. But right now, my guest is one half of Never Mind the Damn Bus. It's a fantastic podcast about Bomber Command and is a well-renowned Bomber Command historian. She has recently, however, become a tad obsessed with Norway and has spent quite a bit of time exploring the battlefields there. Jane joins us now to talk about the area the Operation Claymore campaign happened in. So I'll bring her in now. Good evening, Jane. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. I'm great, thank you. It's lovely to be back on the show again.
I'm glad to have you here. So from everything I've heard from people who've been to Norway, it seems to be one of those places that kind of once you go, like a Pringles, once you pop, you can't stop. You just want to keep going back. Is that basically how it's been for you?
That's absolutely how it's been for me. So this all stemmed from a trip to see the Northern Lights in February 2023, would you believe, up in the Lofoten Islands. And this then turned into a 2-year and counting research project and also my 4th book. Nothing to do with Bomber Command whatsoever. But yeah, it's become an absolute obsession, really. So, but I'll be explaining why and showing people some of the photographs that I took on that journey. So you can see for yourselves just exactly what it's like. Basically.
And as we get into discussion, I think one of the temptations with all aspects of history is to do lots of what if and maybe if they and may coulda, shoulda, woulda stuff. And I think 1940, when people do that, they look a lot at the French campaign and should the generals have been doing this, should the French have had communications in the tanks. But I think Norway is the campaign where maybe tweak a few things in different ways, and the whole course of World War II could have gone differently in 1940 and 1941. And I think that's why getting into the discussions about Norway are interesting. But anyway, we'll bring your slides up. So, folks, you know the score. Kind of fire away with questions if you have them, but I think a lot of them will be covered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to Jane to take us to Operation Claymore and her. We'll all get jealous. You know what's going to happen now. We're all going to get jealous of the amazing photos and experiences you've had. But hey, it's over to you. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. So yeah, tonight I'm going to be talking about Operation Claymore, about the sort of run up to it, and also particularly not so much the operation itself, but about the aftermath. That's something that doesn't really get talked about very much. So can we click on to the next slide straight away? Lofoten Islands, where are they? So they are right up in the far north of Norway, right up within the Arctic Circle, basically. They are a string of islands which are pretty much dedicated to the fishing industry. And it really is the most beautiful place on Earth. Now, I've been all over the world. I'm very fortunate to be able to say that. But the Lofoten Islands are the most beautiful place I have ever visited. It's so beautiful, it just doesn't seem real. It's like a film set or CGI. You feel like you're in, I don't know, Lord of the Rings or a fairy tale almost. For example, if you click on the next slide 3, that's the little town of Rhina on the far west of the Lofoten Islands. I mean, just look at that. It just looks like someone has just painted it, doesn't it?
It looks like those Bob Ross paintings back in the day, doesn't it? And every time I've seen your Facebook posts, I've both been envious and hated you at the same time for the journey.
Yeah. So anyway, this trip to see the Northern Lights was arranged, but me being me, I immediately thought, well, what's going on during the war? I'd never heard of Operation Claymore until then, so I began digging into it further, doing a bit of research. I couldn't find any detailed books on the raids in English. There are plenty in Norwegian. There are mentions of the raids in other books about the commandos, about sort of combined operations generally, but nothing sort of specifically on the entire raid and its aftermath itself. So me being me, of course, I decided to write one. So the gist of the existing accounts is basically that Operation Claymore is a tryout for the commandos. It's arguably a pinch hit for Enigma materials. It's very successful. There's no opposition, jolly good show kind of thing. But as I researched further, I quickly realized that's only half of the story. And that's the British half of the story. And that's the only half we ever hear. What was the impact on these Norwegian communities? So whatever the motivation was for the raid, I began to uncover individual stories of the men and women involved at the sharp end. and who were caught up in the aftermath. And it's their stories that I'm planning to tell in the book that I'm working on at the moment. So first of all, let's get back to basics. A brief summary of where we are in 1940, early 1941. So I think it's fair to say that the Norwegians had been taken completely by surprise by the German invasion in April 1940. As far as they'd been concerned, since the invasion of Poland in September 39 and the inevitable declaration of war by the Allies, the conflict was basically someone else's war, a struggle between Europe's great powers, really, which has got nothing to do with neutral Norway, and Norway clings to its neutrality. So in April 1940, after months of prevarication and indecision by the principal combatants, if you like, the Germans launch Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. So Hitler thinks straight away that control of Norway is going to give his fleet early access to the Atlantic. He's going to be able to establish naval U-boat and Luftwaffe bases and Norway's lengthy coastline, which is going to help him threaten British supply routes and, crucially, protect the mineral imports from Sweden coming in via Narvik, and also forestalling any planned Allied troop landings. Hitler's got this fixation on Norway throughout the course of the war, and he's convinced that there's going to be an invasion. Why anybody in their right mind would try and invade through Norway, I've got no idea, but there we are. So in the meantime, the Allies and the British are dithering about, making complex plans to land troops at various points on the Norwegian coast before opting instead for mine laying in Norwegian waters, and then changing their minds again, by which time it's too late. And by the time intelligence is received that German naval ships are heading towards Norway, it's confusion, indecision, and disbelief, basically. So at first, the British think this is just a breakout attempt by the German fleet to head to Atlantic waters, laden with men for proposed Norwegian landings, was stood down, and all efforts are diverted into trying to block the movement of Kriegsmarine Armada. But the Norwegian government themselves had completely failed to recognise the scale of the threat from Germany in the preceding months. They're too busy looking at what Britain's doing and about this threat to Norwegian neutrality. Obviously, they're petrified that they're going to get dragged into the conflict, but they're looking at it from the wrong perspective. But there'd been plenty of intelligence available to both the Norwegians and the British regarding German intentions, but this was either disbelieved or, in some cases, deliberately ignored. There's a fantastic quote by Norwegian historian Geir Haar, who believes that the willingness of the British decision makers to engage in complicated and far-reaching operations with so limited preparations and so little knowledge of things Norwegian is startling, as is their risk, as is the lack of realistic analysis of German intentions. So yeah, basically the British are just blundering along. They haven't got a clue what they're doing.
I mean, this is the era, Jane, isn't it, of the British just trying to do something. It's still the response to Churchill's commando order. Is it that they're not necessarily thinking long-term and strategic gains? They're thinking of kind of running in, giving the enemy a bloody nose, and then running out again. And we're seeing this with various commando raids through 41, 42. It's really, as I say, short-term thinking as opposed to the effect it'll have on the country that they're doing this, whatever endeavor in.
Yeah. So I describe it in the book as a combination of bluff, bluster, bellicosity, hubris, overconfidence, and naivety, which I think has far-reaching implications later in the campaign too, especially for the citizens of the Lofoten Islands. So British involvement in Norway, despite the victories in the battles of Narvik, is an absolute fiasco, and troops are hastily withdrawn thereafter, obviously, in end of May 1940 to fight the enemy closer to home after the invasion of the Low Countries in France. Winston Churchill is PM by now, obviously, and I think it's fair to say that Churchill, like Hitler, was also obsessed with Norway. Yeah. So we have to look at the state of the war in late 1940. Germany and her allies are occupying vast swathes of Europe, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Threat of invasion is still being considered by the British to be very real, although the immediate threat has perhaps passed by late October following the Battle of Britain. The Blitz has begun. London and other British cities are being bombed by the Luftwaffe night after night, and Britain and her Empire allies are very much on the back foot. The situation looks pretty dire. So where do the Lofoten Islands fit into all of this? And what, if any, is their strategic importance? We first need to return to the ill-fated Norwegian campaign and the role the islands played in the spring and summer of 1940, into a little place called Skelfjord, which is in slide 4. Oh, well, I'll just mention this one. On the way to Skelfjord, you pass Hamnorge. This is the photograph that everybody takes of the Lofoten Islands. Google Lofoten Islands, and I guarantee this photograph will come up. So you've got to take this photo. So we did. Yeah.
Show off. Yeah.
Show off. Yeah. We've got. I mean, just look at it. It's just like
it is. It's picture perfect, isn't it? Yeah.
It is absolutely. So a freezing cold morning in February 2023, we're traveling westwards towards the settlements of Reine and Moskenes, and it's absolutely freezing. As you can see, the sky's clear, dazzlingly blue, absolutely freezing. It just, like, the wind just cuts straight through you. It's so cold. And along the E10 route, the main highway, which runs down the entire length of the islands, there's a little brown sign by the side of the road, and all it says is Krigsminne, which means war memorial in Norwegian. So again, maybe me said, right, come on, let's have a look down here, and basically ended up in this most stunning fjord. As you can see from the photographs, it's just these cliffs covered in snow and ice, beautiful blue skies, crystal clear icy water. There's a little sort of narrow track, and there's a small scattering of red and yellow houses and shabby boat sheds, sort of your typical Norwegian scene, if you like. The occasional rickety wooden jetty protruding into the waters. And at the end of one of these jetties, looking down the fjord towards the open sea, is this stone pillar, and it bears a silver plate engraved with the following words, which translated from Norwegian: to the memory of the Norwegians and allies who gave their lives for Norway's freedom, and the events that took place in Skelfjord in April to May 1940. So it's so peaceful and so quiet and so beautiful there now. But in 1940, it was very, very different. 200 residents of this little place found themselves at the heart of the British naval campaign against German forces in Narvik and northern Norway. And the reason for that was that many a damaged destroyer sought refuge here, because a temporary repair yard was quickly established. And the fleet repair vessel Vindictive, which I think was a converted aircraft carrier from the First World War, was used to patch up the ships that were being damaged in the battle around Narvik, and to render them sufficiently seaworthy to get back to Britain for comprehensive repairs. It's also the place where injured Allied servicemen and German personnel captured during the first battle were taken for urgent medical treatment at the island's hospital at Gravdal. Now, among those seeking sanctuary in Skelfjord, which later became known as Norway's Scapa Flow, is the cruiser HMS Penelope, which ran aground off Fleinvær on the 11th of April, while hunting German merchant ships entering the Vestfjord. Her boiler room was flooded and she was hauled forward, and the tribal-class destroyer Eskimo managed to tow her back to an improvised base. She's patched up, and then she's successfully towed back to the Clyde. Now, Eskimo herself is destined to become one of the fjord's most famous visitors, and just a day after rescuing Penelope, Eskimo was almost blown out of the water by a torpedo fired by the George Theler. And her bow was blown clean off, as you can see from the picture, and 13 of her crew were killed. Miraculously, this ship does not sink. And she too is towed to Skelfjord for repairs. Incredibly, just 5 months later, Eskimo is back in action, and she actually goes on to survive the war, and she actually takes part in Operation Claymore in March 1941. So on the jetty where the War Memorial now stands, there's a pair of wooden benches donated by the Eskimo and Penelope associations in memory of those events and of the crew members lost. The Germans are mystified at this point in time as to the location of the damaged Royal Naval units. They know that they're being repaired somewhere, but they can't pinpoint exactly where it is. At its peak, Skelfjord was sheltering over 30 Royal Naval vessels, including warships, captured German merchant vessels, tugs, maintenance craft, salvage boats, and supply ships. There's also Norwegian engineers who were recruited to come in and fix the ships as well. But then a German aircraft reconnaissance aircraft spots what's going on, and then all hell breaks loose. And there are bombing raids and attacks on the fjord. And there's a lovely account by a boy who was 9 years old at the time, Jon Anders Jonsson, and his 13-year-old brother Knut had been watching the activity aboard Penelope and Eskimo, which was still undergoing repair, when all hell breaks loose. He describes the sky turning black as German aircraft sweeps over the fjord, dropping their bombs on the temporary naval base. And the noise is utterly unbearable because the cannons on the decks of Penelope and Eskimo and the other Allied ships, which are still operational, open up against these aircraft. Bombs are falling all around. Several crewmen are killed as well. So it's absolute chaos. And it's shortly after this time that the Allies abandon Skelfjord, and that's it. As far as the Lofoten Islanders think, they think, well, that's us out of the picture now. However, fast forward a few months to autumn 1940. Can we have slide 7, please? So yeah, this is a more detailed map of the Lofoten Islands, which shows the position of the raids on the 4th of March 1941, but also subsequent raids in 26th, 27th of December 1941 as well, during Operation Anklet. I'm going to talk mainly about Claymore today, otherwise we'll be here all night. So Claymore first arises then, or the idea for Claymore first arises in the autumn of 1940, and it's first thought of by a Norwegian naval officer who'd escaped at the time of the invasion. And he suggested that the fish oil industry, which is based in the Lofoten Islands, might be a useful target for some sort of military operation by the British. This idea gets passed on to the Ministry of Economic Warfare and quickly begins to gather momentum. Hugh Dalton at the MEW is very keen on the plan, but initially it's envisaged that it's going to be carried out by Norwegians themselves. And Churchill is absolutely not having that when that idea is run past him. The idea begins to gain momentum, though. Combined operations, obviously in their infancy, get involved. And a plan is quickly formulated for a raid on the island by British forces, with the Norwegians in a supporting liaison role. It seems the perfect opportunity to blood the new commando forces who've been training in the Scottish Highlands, to garner some much needed positive news and boost morale. Yeah. But in the main, I think it's a question, as you've said, of being seen to do something against an all-powerful enemy. So obviously the Navy in particular have some familiarity with the islands, having used Skelfjord as a temporary base during the Narvik battles. So plans begin to be pulled together, and the operation is given the name Claymore after the short Scottish sword, retaining a Scottish theme which continues throughout, really. So in January 1941, plans for the raids are first put to Churchill, and he'd sought assurances from the Chiefs of Staff Committee, and he wrote to General Ismay on the 24th of January about the raid, and this is what he says. I should like to feel sure that the Chiefs of Staff have carefully considered whether this operation is likely to stir up the Norwegian coast and lead to reinforcement of the German forces in the peninsula. It seems to me that as the attack is on the island and obviously connected with blockade measures, this danger is obviated. There will be no need to go onto the mainland as I understand the operation. Pray advise me. Then an urgent note is prepared to the Prime Minister and sent on the 27th of January. The Chiefs of Staff don't consider that the operation is likely to stir up the Norwegian coast, or that it's going to lead to reinforcements of German forces in the peninsula or in Norway generally. How wrong they were. And so they sought to reassure the Prime Minister that there's no intention to land anywhere on the mainland. And eventually Churchill gives permission. So it's intended that the raids will be carried out on 4 ports on the Lofoten Islands. We've got Stamsund, Henningsvær, Svolvær, which is the capital, and Britishnes. What do these places have in common? Well, they're all fishing ports where fish is processed for consumption and where fish oil is extracted. The ports themselves, they've got no military or strategic importance whatsoever. And there's only a handful of Germans on the islands, half of whom are actually German civilians who've come to take over the management of the fishing industry and to ensure that all fish caught on the islands is imported to the Reich. There's 2 small Luftwaffe wireless posts, one at Kavelberg, west of Svolvær, and on the island of Rost, which is right at the very, very far end of the chain of islands. The Kavelberg lads are very, very young, the eldest is only around 24, I think. And I cannot even begin to describe how bored these lads are being stuck up here in the absolute middle of nowhere. There's nothing for them to do, very little in the way of their actual duties to perform. Nothing ever happens up there. It's so remote. And these guys are absolutely bored stiff. There's also a handful of SS police on the island, supported by local police chief Al Birkeland, a Quisling, and Henrik Hulas, who works at the local sheriff's office, and the German harbour police, who keep an eye on who and what is coming in and out of the islands. But they've mainly got like a customs role. So at the port of Svolvær, the main town on the islands, there are lots of comings and goings. The Mira, lots of your viewers will have heard of the Hurtigruten, the postal boat, which you can take a cruise on, well, you can call it a cruise, up and down the length of Norway, even today. And it stops in Svolvær and in Stamsund. Lots of German vessels stop there to take on supplies and fuel as they're transporting military personnel between Narvik and the main naval base down at Trondheim. So there's lots of people going on and returning from leave. But these people tend only to be in port for a few hours. So there's no big military presence on the islands at all. There's also armed trawlers on the lookout for British submarines. They patrol up and down again between Narvik and Trondheim, backwards and forwards across the Vestfjord. One of these trawlers is Krebs, famous as we'll discuss later on. It's captained by a World War I veteran. I think it's called Capfinger or something like that. There's also a massive fish processing factory ship called the Hamburg, which is moored just off Svolvær as well. And I'm going to go into more detail about some of the people who are involved on these vessels later on this evening. So let's have a closer look at some of the targets. This is the bit where I get to show off my holiday photographs.
Just one question before we move on, Jane.
Yeah.
Andreas is saying, based on that photo, seems they are all linked by bridges. Was that so already the case in World War II?
Well spotted, Andreas. No, there are no bridges and no connecting roads at all at this time. The only way to access these islands or to get from island to island is by boat. There are no bridges between them at all at this point in time. Okay. This highway, the E10, I think, was only built in the 70s, possibly early 80s. There's no links between them. So I'm going to focus in particular on Stamsund and Henningsvær. There's two reasons for this. Most of my research focuses on the townsfolk of Stamsund, and Henningsvær is just so ridiculously picturesque. There's a fantastic little museum in Stamsund, a war museum. When we went there, there was nobody there. It was closed. Well, I say it was closed. The door was wide open, so you could just go in and wander around. But it was brilliant, and the amount of information that they've got on the raid is just fantastic. Photographs, everything. So as you can see from the photograph, this is the perfect kind of location for a commando raid. Lovely little harbour, easy to get in, easy access, easy to get onto the ground for amphibious landings, etc. Next picture. Yeah, so your typical Norwegian fishing village, really. So at the time that the raid was taking place in March 1941, the population of these ports on the Lofoten Islands is swollen by thousands of extra fishermen who come in from the for the cod fishing season, which lasts between January and April usually. So as far as the raid itself is concerned, then they also attack the port of Henningsvær. Can we have a look at that one? Next picture, I think. Yeah. So Henningsvær is again just this loop of this chain of islands. It's an incredible place, really. Some of your viewers will be familiar with the famous football ground at Henningsvær, which is one of the most famous in the world. You can see that in the top right hand corner there, that little sort of green patch.
Oh, the green patch, yeah.
Yeah, in the middle. Yeah, it's a really spectacular location. It's much sort of beloved by Instagrammers, etc., who go there with their drones and take all wonderful photos like this. This is not one of mine, I hasten to add. If you go on to the next photo, we can see a bit more of what the lie of the land is like. And this is where the commandos would have been coming into the main port area of Henningsvær. Lots of warehouses on either side, and in 1941 there would have also been lots of big oil tanks from the fish processing industry containing fish oil, but also petroleum and things as well, for fueling the shipping fleet. Can I have the next one as well? Yeah, and this is just like, happens to be a nice photo. So you can see how gorgeous this place is. It's absolutely beautiful. It's stunning. So the fishing villages of Stamsund and Henningsvær are attacked by 3 commando, led by Major John Durnford Slater, who many of your listeners and viewers will know, and accompanied by Captain Ronald, whilst objectives in the island capital Svolvær and the tiny fishing village harbour at Britishness are seized by 4 commando under the command of Major Lister, who's accompanied by Peter Young, who actually writes about this incident in his book Storm from the Sea, and Lord Lovett, acting as an observer. Young and Durnford Slater both write quite detailed, if not entirely accurate, accounts of the raid in subsequent years. That's a whole other field about veteran memories and what have you, and how accurate they are. So what I'm going to do is to read a little extract from the intelligence report completed on the 4th of April, a month after the raid. Can we have slide 13, please? Yeah. So this is an actual photograph from one of the troop carriers preparing for the raid. So this is an extract from an intelligence report completed on the 4th of April, and it appears in the MI9 records at the National Archives. This raid was the first seaborne raid on the enemy-occupied coast to use the equipment and personnel specially designed for that purpose. It may be regarded as a full dress rehearsal for more serious endeavours. The primary object was to destroy the main facilities producing herring and cod oil in these islands. The importance of these commodities lies in the fact that, being rich in vitamin A and D, they can make up the serious deficiency of fats in the present German diet. The total production of these fisheries goes to Germany, some of it in the form of fish meal for manure. The secondary objects were to support and encourage anti-German feeling in Norway, particularly by arresting supporters of the Quisling Party, and to afford an opportunity for local seamen to join the Norwegian Navy in this country, i.e. back in Britain. So they're basically wanting to take people back. The capture or destruction of fuel or German-controlled shipping and property and oil stocks naturally formed part of the plan. The date of the operation was governed by the period of the fishing season in this district, which is early January to April, the desirability of taking advantage of the long winter nights, the necessity of using a moonless period for the approach and withdrawal, and finally the availability of raiding ships suitable for an operation at a range of some 800 miles. There was, moreover, the difficulty of providing the necessary destroyers, number of destroyers being barely sufficient for their normal escort commitments. So basically the short destroyers at this time. This paragraph always makes me laugh because they made a complete balls up of the timing of the operation, because they arrive at 6 o'clock in the morning. Some idiot back in planning said, oh yes, you know, it's dark in the Arctic at night. It'll be pitch dark, you know, it's the middle of winter, it'll be pitch dark until practically dinner time. Of course it wasn't. It's March by this point in time. And when they actually arrive there at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's broad daylight. Mm-hmm. So again, you know, this just demonstrates that the absolute naivety that the British had in approaching these operations. So the ports selected, as I've said, are the 4 southern ones on the islands, in the Vestfjord, Svolvær, Stamsund, Henningsvær, and Britishness. All intelligence pointed to the unlikelihood of there being any garrison or defences at these ports, but it was realised that considerable enemy forces could quickly be sent there, i.e. from Narvik, if news of the impending raid leaked out or its probable destination was disclosed by air reconnaissance whilst on passage. And as a result, they were going very heavily armed. Ample provision was made for an opposed landing. So the landing force consists of 500 special service troops from numbers 3 and 4 commandos, 1 section, number 55 Field Company Royal Engineers, 4 officers and 48 other ranks of Norwegian troops, including Captain Martin Linge, who I will be mentioning later on. Then you've got from the Rodney, naval demolition parties from HMS Nelson as well. You've got local pilots and guides selected from Norwegian naval personnel in the UK. And the above are all carried on converted Dutch cross-channel ferries, the HMS Queen Emma and the HMS Princess Beatrix. And they're escorted by 5 destroyers Somali, Bedouin, Tartar, Legion, and Eskimo. And the headquarters are on board Somali. So the outward passage is uneventful, and the expedition arrived off the objective at daybreak on the 4th of March in exceptionally fine weather. It had still snow, as you can see. It's very cold, but it's very, very sunny. So the landing is timed to take place at each of the 4 ports at 6:45 a.m. Can we have the next slide, please? Each raiding ship is to launch the attack on 2 ports. The unexpectedly good visibility resulted in the approach of the landing craft being made in rather better light than was required or was desirable. That's one way of putting it. They're basically doing it in broad daylight. This picture here shows the troops alighting at Stamsund. And you know that little quay where we had the picture of the lovely orange warehouses? That's just about around there. So at no point on shore was any opposition encountered, and the report from the intelligence services says the welcome of our troops by the inhabitants was even more enthusiastic than had been expected. This was subsequently enhanced by the sight of destruction of German property, the arrest of Germans and Quislings, and the distribution of comforts, foodstuffs, cigarettes, clothing, etc., which are brought with the expedition. About half an hour before the landing took place, Somali intercepted the German armed trawler Krebs, 8 miles southeast of Svolvær, and sank her after boarding and searching her. This ship proved to be the only German warship, if you can call it that, it's an armed trawler, in the vicinity, and the few rounds she fired at Somali were the only opposition encountered ashore, afloat, or from the air. What this report doesn't mention is that obviously from the Krebs it received bits of the Enigma machine and code books, etc., which were extremely important subsequently. I'm going to come on to talk about this in a little bit more detail, because I know there's been some theories put forward about whether or not this was the actual basis and purpose of the raid. The report continues, there were 2 pleasant surprises which added considerably to the usefulness of the raid. The first, the presence of the German fish refrigerating and factory ship Hamburg. And the other event was the discovery that the Germans had an observer post at Kabelweg outside Svolvær, and this resulted in the capture of the Air Force personnel stationed there. So the 15 young German Luftwaffe men, the young lads who I talked about before, the extremely bored ones, are now not so bored because they've just been captured. Can we go on to slide 15, please?
Just a quick question for you. If you can't answer it, David O'Keefe is in the sidebar, or maybe he can complement your answer. You talked about earlier on. It's several things, Claymore. It's both kind of a classic morale boosting thing. It's fish oil. It's also potentially a pinch raid, because you talked about the Enigma there. In your research so far, and your book is a couple of years away, do you know what kind of priority they're looking at it? Is it like morale boost first, then pinch raid? Do you have an idea of kind of what order the priorities are?
Well, I am going to sort of come on to discuss this, because the pinch raids isn't sort of specifically mentioned in so many words, if that's what it actually is.
Yeah.
And I've discussed this with David in some length, and I will be discussing it with him again, I think, shortly, because I've got some questions for him. David's very kindly shared much of his material and archival material with me on this. But yeah, in the sort of planning, there's not a great deal mentioned about that. It's all about just basically being seen to be doing something, giving the combined services a run out, if you like, seeing what we can do against the Germans, and is it just one giant publicity stunt? That's another argument.
I mean that's what you get with the raids of this era. It's sort of they're written on the back of a fag packet in the pub. It's like, go and have a go. And we think of it from the kind of the 44-45 era of everything being laid out much more precisely with primary objectives, secondary objectives, and that's. This isn't that era. David added in the sidebar, Bletchley claims Inception was pinch, so he's saying it's quite up there. So there we are. That's a great.
Yeah, I know there are sort of reports in 1947 to say that it was to do that, but if you look at the actual planning documentation, there's not a great deal in there. So whether that's sort of to mention with hindsight, I don't know. Again, that's something that I want to discuss with David further. So Going back to the actual raid itself, then the material damage on shore includes the demolition of all fish oil plants and fish meal factories working for the Germans. These are not German property. These are Norwegian companies and Norwegian businesses. And all the tanks at all four ports, oil tanks are all destroyed. 800,000 gallons of kerosene, paraffin and solar oil are destroyed. Afloat, the bag was 5 German and 1 Norwegian merchant ships, the latter under German control, in addition to the Hamburg referred to above. Also 3 German trawlers in addition to Krebs. The total was 11 ships amounting to about 18,000 tons of shipping. Of these, 1 merchant ship and 2 trawlers were sunk by naval gunfire or blown up by the demolition parties. Slide 16, please. As previously arranged, re-embarkation took place at about noon. Both raiding ships had hoisted their landing craft and were ready to go by 1300 hours. So they'd only been there since 7:15 in the morning, caused all this devastation, and were ready to go again by 1 o'clock. So it's literally like 5 or 6 hours, and that's it. The only incident on the homeward passage is at 4:30 on the same day. They are spotted by a German aircraft at 6,000 feet. It was engaged unsuccessfully by anti-aircraft fire. And now, aboard. If you look at that photograph in the middle, you can see a man in like a Homburg hat in the middle of that crowd. What's he doing? There's some more towards the back as well. Obviously, civilians. What are they doing there? Well, the following were embarked for the return passage. 213 enemy subjects, including civilians and captured merchant seamen, and Norwegian Quisling supporters. I think there were 12 of those. Total prisoners captured, 225. But perhaps more importantly, there were 314 Norwegian volunteers taken back to the ships, including 8 women. So imagine these people are just going about their business, just getting out of bed on the morning, going to work, whatever. All hell breaks loose. All this is going off. Hundreds of British soldiers turn up. Everything's getting blown up all around them. And then there's someone on the quay side with a megaphone saying, anyone who wants to come to England, get in the boat now. How do you make that decision? It's mad. It's absolutely insane. But 314 people do. So there's 539 extra passengers then, the prisoners and the volunteers, all going back on the Queen Emma, making a total complement of 852 aboard, of which 8 are seriously wounded. So obviously you can imagine what conditions were like on the Emma going back. Now, the intelligence report says, the whole operation went according to plan and may be described as an unqualified success. That is not to say that lessons were not learned. The seagoing qualities of the raiding ships, the operation of the landing craft, the signal communications and the behaviour of the troops were all satisfactory. The inter-service cooperation, this is really, really important, both in training and execution, worked smoothly, and the destroyer crews enjoyed the change from their normal duties. From what is known of the effects of this raid, the Germans were much enraged. You're telling me they were. The Norwegians were greatly cheered. That remains to be seen. And other occupied countries and neutrals were duly impressed. An immediate result was an abundance of fish for local consumption, owing to the Germans' inability to make use of the catch for themselves. German reprisals, which were inevitable, resulted in improving morale throughout Norway. I can't even begin to describe my views on that statement. And the influx of patriots escaping to this country immediately increased. Now, John Durnford Slater recalled, heading away from Norway after a successful operation with the ship throbbing its heart out at 24 knots is a great feeling, especially with a couple of gins and a good lunch inside you. Now, Peter Young, who was part of the Svolvær raiding party, was a bit more philosophical about it. And he says, this raid, coming as it did after a long period of frustration, was a great encouragement for the future. It was indeed unsatisfactory that there had been no fighting, but most of the soldiers were content that our objects had been achieved. A raid with no fighting was better than no raid at all. So the raid also inspired other written accounts as well. Evan John, who was aboard one of the ships, wrote a small book later called The Lofoten Letter. which is basically the form of a letter to his wife about the journey, obviously heavily censored. London-based Hungarian journalist George Mikes wrote The Epic of Lofoten, based on accounts of the occupation and the raid from some of the men who escaped on the islands with the raiders. Now, I've researched this book in great detail and of course referenced it with the Norwegian archival documents. I've actually been able to identify some of the people who appear in the book. All names were actually anonymised at the time to protect their families in Norway. And in one instance to make contact with family members as well, which is quite exciting. The raid's also an influence on the 1942 film, The Day Will Dawn, and there are incidents reenacted in that film which are based on events which occurred in the Lofoten Islands during the occupation. For example, a dance hall incident at Rost. There was a dance hall on the little island of Rost where the other German Luftwaffe wireless post was, and they were having a concert and a dance. Some of the German soldiers tried to force their way in. One of the acts was a girl who was singing rude songs about the Germans, what the German officer objected. He told everyone to basically get out and stop singing these songs, etc. The locals refused. The lights were turned off. He went ballistic. He started shouting at everybody, demanding that the lights be put on. The person up refusing to put the lights back on. He starts firing his gun around, and there ends up with 3 or 4 local people dead as a result of this incident. And that's an incident which is portrayed in this film. So is Claymore just one giant publicity stunt and an opportunity to try out a combined operation at minimal risk, or is there more to it than that, as David O'Keefe has argued? With regard to the publicity, it's all in the UK newspapers the following day. The Illustrated News, of which I have an original copy, there's a double spread on it within a couple of days of the raid actually taking place. There are actually embedded journalists like John Nixon from Reuters aboard the Queen Emma, and he files this news report, How the Royal Navy Singed Hitler's Moustache. And I'll just quote a little bit from that report. You can just imagine it, the sort of language at the time, with a rousing score being played in the background in cinemas, etc. Here is the first and only eyewitness account of the daring and conspicuously successful raid by British naval and military forces on German objectives on the Norwegian coast on Tuesday. I am writing it as we steam away from the scene of the operations. As use of our wireless would reveal our position, it can't be transmitted yet. Great pillars of smoke and flame rising against and dwarfing snow-covered mountains which drop sheer into the sea along this part of the fjords, leading to Narvik, testament to the destructiveness of the raid. One dense black column reaches a height of 6,000 feet, billowing out far above the clouds. Another envelopes the mountains for miles in a thick fog-like pall. The operation took the Germans completely by surprise. For many hours, our ships were on Hitler's back doorstep. Well, it was 5.5 hours, actually, but no attempt was made to interfere with them. It may be considered as a further sign that on land, as well as on sea and in the air, Britain has now passed from the defensive to the offensive in Europe. I think that's quite an important point. That's certainly what the British are wanting to portray by this raid. There's also a British Army film crew on board to document the whole thing. You can actually watch the short film that they made. It's on the RWM site. I thoroughly recommend it. Part of this film includes an officer sending a telegram to Hitler. Again, the whole thing is just so staged. There's an officer who takes his skis with him, and does a bit of skiing while he's there, kind of thing. It's, I don't know, the whole thing just feels so kind of staged and almost fake, if you know what I mean. So knowing what I know now, the arrogance and hubris of the reports is utterly astounding. I think it perfectly illustrates the patronizing British attitude towards Norway and the Norwegian people at this point in the war. Thinking about the impact of the raid, there's an account by a guy called Gunnar Miklevik, who was just a teenager at the time. He was working on one of the fish factories in Stamsund when the British arrive. And the Norwegians, when they see all these boats coming towards them, and when they realise they're not Germans, that they're actually British, these poor Norwegians, they think it's the liberation. They think that their war's over, and just the psychological impact that must have had, knowing that these people are only actually staying for a few hours. The intelligence report I referred to above as well completely fails to mention the sinking by HMS Bedouin of the Hurtigruten ferry, the Mira, remember who I mentioned at the beginning, just south of Svolvær by mistake. This is a civilian passenger ferry, and this resulted in the death of 7 Norwegian civilians, including a teenage girl who has both of her legs blown off. And this is basically covered up by the British authorities. Official reports mention the captain of the ferry being forced to sail at gunpoint by a German officer, but that remains extremely contentious, and I think it may well have even been invented to obscure the truth. I've obtained the documents from the inquest held in Svolvær a couple of days later, and again, this is something which I'll be examining in a lot more detail in the book. Obviously, the press reports don't mention any of that. As we've mentioned, one success from the raid is the recovery from the trawler Krebs, documentation, equipment relevant to the Enigma codes. There were very detailed descriptions in the intelligence reports of the documents and other items being recovered from Krebs, which would obviously prove to be of enormous importance in the intelligence battle. As I've said, I know David O'Keefe has covered this in his book about the Dieppe raid, which I thoroughly recommend everyone to read. It's absolutely fascinating, and I've discussed it with him. David argues that the Lofoten raid is a pinch hit as well. Having reviewed all the archival documents, I'm still sort of weighing up that up. I'm still undecided. I think David and I will have some more further discussions about that. But what I want to focus on now is the intelligence report mentions the inevitable German reprisals, which resulted in improving morale throughout Norway. This assessment is just breathtaking in its arrogance and the manner in which it patronises the Norwegians. And this is one of the aspects that I really, really want to focus on in the book. So what do these inevitable German reprisals actually look like? Well, first of all, the Gestapo now arrive on the islands and set up a bureau in Svolvær. Can we have slide 17, please? The very next day after the raids, German troops and SS police arrive in each of the 4 ports. And the parents, many of them elderly, of the young men and women who have escaped back to Britain with the commandos, are rounded up, arrested, and in many cases beaten. Some of them are thrown out of their homes onto the street, and their houses and all their possessions are burned to the ground. This picture shows the torching of the Janssen family home in Svolvær on the 6th of March 1941. You can see basically a German demolition guy in front with his box of dynamite, etc., deliberately blowing it up. Can we skip forward 2 slides to slide 19? Yeah. 64 people, mainly family members of those who'd escaped, are arrested and taken away. And these 64 men are the first residents of the infamous Greenie prison camp near Oslo, and they're known as the Greenie 64. Most are eventually released, but I believe 1 or 2 may have died in captivity. I've actually been able to obtain a copy of the prison admissions book from the Norwegian National Archives, which records their entry and release details. And you can see on the list on the left-hand side that they were all from Svolvær, Stamsund, etc. So all of these people come from the Lofoten Islands. There's an economic impact as well. Operation Claymore has utterly devastated the 4 fishing communities, with business and livelihoods burnt to the ground. And there's also a human toll, not just in terms of the casualties I've referred to before, but the 340 Norwegian volunteers for the armed forces and merchant navy. Now, these are mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s, but some are a lot older, like 42-year-old journalist Jarle Holst-Trygg from Stamsund. He was actually the local mayor, a passionate trade unionist, ran the local newspaper, the Lofoten Folkebladet, and it's one of the main figures in my book. He'd made several previous unsuccessful escape attempts, and remember, any attempt to escape is punishable by death at this point in time. 8 of the young women from Svolvær who wanted to volunteer for nursing duties also returned to Britain with the raiders. So families are deprived of their bread-winning sons and daughters. Trawler captains suddenly have no crews. The fish factories have suddenly got no staff. So whole communities are decimated in the space of just a few hours. And you can barely imagine what it must have been like having to make such a momentous decision in the space of a few hours to leave or to stay, and the sort of hasty and heartfelt farewells on the quayside. And many of those who did decide to leave would never see their parents or the sweethearts or their homeland of Norway again. So I've been researching some of the stories of the young men who came to Britain, Many joined the merchant navy and served on the Atlantic and Arctic convoys. Others joined the armed forces and the Royal Norwegian Air Force and went over to Canada to train before joining up with Allied air forces. Some served as aircrew with bomber and fighter command. Many joined the army and went to train in northern Scotland with Company Linga. I think you've had an episode about that recently, and the other commando units. Some trained as SOE agents and were dropped back behind Norwegian lines. Others, like Leif Larsen, one of the Stamson lads who joined commandos, gave their lives in the fighting in Northwest Europe in 1944 and 45. Larsen was killed during the Battle for the Scheldt. And as for what happened to Jarle, well, you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to him. If we can switch back to photograph 18, please, just the previous one. Yeah. So this is prisoners from the Lofoten raid arriving in Scotland. And what you'll notice immediately about these are civilians. They are German civilians, German merchant seamen, and quislings. I've also researched some of the stories of the prisoners who were captured, and their stories are particularly interesting. I've been able to access their MI9 interrogation records, which are absolutely fascinating. They provide a real insight into the political opinions, beliefs, and motivations, and also what life is like in the Third Reich at this point in time. So we've basically got three categories of prisoner. We've got German naval and Luftwaffe personnel. We've got the survivors from the Krebs, plus the lads from the Luftwaffe base at Kavelberg. We've got the German civilians who are working in the fishing industry, and the German merchant seamen. I'll just talk about a couple of these German civilians. So we've got a guy called Richard George. He arrives in Samsund in the new year, and he's keen to get in the action on the lucrative fish business. He's a very wealthy man. He's 55. He's held the offices of president of the Chamber of Commerce in Königsberg. He's vice president of the East Prussian Chamber of Commerce. He's a very active and enthusiastic Nazi Party member. He joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and the SA in 1932, and he'd only recently been promoted to the rank of Sturmbannführer, a paramilitary rank, I think, which is roughly equivalent to the rank of major. And not all of the seamen who'd found themselves on the Lofoten Islands in late February 41 were there by choice. Typical of these was a chap called Seaman Brodel. He's a German civilian and a crew member aboard a merchant ship called the Eilenau. He was actually married to a Dutch woman, and he'd been living and working in Holland in May 1940 when the Germans invaded. He's immediately detained and sent to an internment camp. And from there, he somehow ends up in Algeria, and then he's sent back to Germany. He wasn't allowed to return to his wife and family in Holland. And when the authorities discovered that he was a sailor by trade, he was immediately drafted into the merchant service and sent to join the Eilenau, which subsequently sailed for Norway. We've got another of the party is Karl Schutze, age 33. He's from Hamburg. He'd been a member of the Communist Party and was particularly active in 1932 and the first half of 1933. He had a small printing press, which he used to print pamphlets, which he afterwards helped distribute around Hamburg. In July 33, together with 500 Hamburg communists, he's actually arrested and thrown into prison. Initially, he's put in solitary confinement, interrogated 2 or 3 times a week. He would later recall being held in the interrogation rooms guarded by SS and SA men armed with nickel dusters and rubber truncheons. Upon his release, like Seaman Brodel, he was then sent off to the Merchant Navy. The experiences of one of Brodel's shipmates aboard the island, another German citizen, a chap called Erich Moller, provided a frightening insight, I think, into life under the Nazis. And again, this is all in their interrogation records. Moller was a bit of a tough, rough type, and he'd actually found himself in a concentration camp just outside Königsberg, where he was detained from November 39 to April 1940. And he described facilities at the camp were rudimentary, to say the least. 5 roughly constructed wooden buildings, each holding 60 men. The camp was full. All the prisoners were Germans, working class, the oldest being about 60. They were serving sentences from 3 months to 1 year for minor offences similar to his own. None of them had undergone trial. Some were there on suspicion only. Some didn't even know why they were there. They're all subjected to what's so-called re-education. They're allowed to send home one written card a month and are given bread and water to eat, with one hot meal every 3 days. On completion of his sentence, Muller is released, and again, he's sent off to join the merchant service. Now, as well as the Germans who end up being brought back to the UK, there are a number of quislings, including Alf Birkeland and Henrik Hulas, who mentioned earlier, the guys in the police. Now, the quislings are detained in prison originally. They're actually in Wormwood Scrubs. The authorities are unsure what to do with them because they're not enemy combatants. They're not enemy aliens. Technically, there was a responsibility of the Norwegian government in exile. And there's lots of correspondence backwards and forwards between the Norwegian government in exile and the British government. And eventually, regulations are passed specifically to allow these men to be sent to internment camps. Of the 12 captured, a few are released. I think 3 are released. 1 goes mad in prison. 1 is seriously ill and dies. And the remainder end up on the Isle of Man before being returned to Norway to be dealt with after the war. There's also military implications, obviously, because exactly what Churchill didn't want to happen, which is the reinforcement of Norway, happens. It becomes Fortress Norway. And examples of fortifications absolutely all over the islands and all over Norway. So there's around 350,000 to 400,000 troops in Norway, most of whom are still there, of course, at the end of the war. There's a massive programme of fortifications, the length and breadth of Norway, and most of them is still there. Prime example is the massive U-boat base at Trondheim, which I visited last year. But there's bits of concrete absolutely everywhere, and particularly sort of up around Narvik. It's absolutely fascinating. There's also fortifications built at Stamsund and Svolvær and other points on the Lofoten Islands. And just behind where we stayed in the village of Bolstad on the south coast, there's the remains of a German observation post. In the article that I wrote on this trip, there's actually a link to a little video which I did about that, which you can see. We'll
that thing you said there about Churchill the last thing Churchill wants is the Germans reinforcing Norway.
Yeah.
But we're meaning in 1941, because 3 years later, that becomes an absolute bonus. And that's that weirdness about the early raids, is that they can have an initial sort of negative result that becomes a positive result later on because the strategic situation has changed in the world. And that's one of the recurring themes of this Norway series, is that Hitler's obsession with Norway means, as you said a minute ago, tens of thousands of troops are kept there that could have been used elsewhere in 44.
That's right. They could have been in Normandy. They could have been on the
time. That was considered a blow, but that's the way in a chess game, I suppose, is that things that the early part of the game, things are going one way, but later on in the game, the situation has changed. It's fascinating.
It is. It's just you just cannot even begin to anticipate how things are going to play out. In sort of 4 or 5 years, it's just impossible. If we go on to photograph 20 now, if we skip back forwards, this is Captain Martin Linger. Now, his story, you could write a film in himself. Martin Linger, before the war, is actually an actor, not an especially good one, it has to be said. But he gets to the UK quite early on after the invasion, and he plays an essential role in Claymore. He joins the Norwegian military over here. Many of you obviously will be familiar with Company Linger, the Norwegian company which bears his name. Norwegian recruits who train for commando and SRE roles in the Cairngorms in Scotland, as I mentioned before. Now, in Claymore, he sort of operates as a liaison officer, if you like. So he's negotiating or speaking to the Norwegian authorities on the islands. He's liaising back with the British officers. He's providing translation facilities. Obviously, it's not many people in the island speak English at this point in time, and he's a crucial link. A crucial link in the raid. And he then is back in Norway in December 1941. He takes part in Operation Archery on Vagsø and Maløy. There's another raid on the Lofoten Islands on the same dates, up in the far west of the islands, up at Rhine, Operation Anklet, which is an absolute disaster. It's if ever there was a bad idea, it's Operation Anklet. But that's a whole other story. And Ling is actually killed during archery, and that's a massive blow to Norwegian forces in the UK. So I just want to touch now on the book that I'm writing and the structure of it. It's not your typical commando raid or military operation book. It tells the story from three different perspectives: the Norwegians, the German civilians and merchant seamen, and from the point of view of a British commando by the name of Noel Kennard. Now, I actually have his diaries, which his family kindly gave to me, which have never ever been published, and they give a whole different perspective on this raid, and also clear up one minor mystery as to why and how one British soldier ends up being shot in the leg on the journey. But again, I'll save that for the book. And what I'm trying to do is to tell these three sets of stories, and they're three sort of different narratives, and explain how these stories all converge on the morning of the 4th of March 1941, and then the impact that this raid actually has on the lives of all of these people involved. So forget about the publicity stunt, forget about the Krebs and the Enigma. What I'm talking about is the impact on people's lives of this raid, and that's something which I don't think has been talked about before. Not in the English language anyway. As I said, there are some fantastic books written in Norwegian, but yes, so that's basically what I'm trying to do in this story. If we can have slide 21. Now, you'll remember that at the outset, you
said you were going there to see the Northern Lights.
To see the aurora, yeah. And you're pleased to know that as well as poking around lots of bits of old concrete, etc., trying to recreate Operation Claymore on this trip, we did actually get to see the aurora. We've got some very, very spectacular photographs. So yeah, that actually did happen. So if we can go on to slide 22. This is, well, the provisional title of the book is from the Reuters news report, Singeing Hitler's Mustache, the Lofoten Commando Raids. Estimated publication date, I think, is going to be 2027. I was wildly optimistic and hoped that it was going to be finished by this year, but I took 6 months out to write the Invisible Campaign instead, in the middle of it. So consequently, I'm about 25% of the way through this book now.
Good.
Yeah. But this trip had some other more expensive results as well. So in addition to inspiring me to research and write this book and multiple subsequent visits to Norway that entailed, I'm now 2 years into learning Norwegian. I can't speak it very well, but I can read quite a lot now, which is great. And I've also somehow ended up buying a house in Norway as well.
Yeah, and we're not jealous at all, Jane.
No,
we're not.
And this is all because some commandos and sappers blew up some fish oil tanks in the middle of Norway in March 1941. So there you are. So yeah, happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Yeah, we've got a few, and I think one of the things that I think you've done is established that something can be two things at the same time. This raid can be both successful and unsuccessful, and neither, depending on your point of view. And I think I like the fact you're approaching it this angle, and there's the impact on the locals, there's the impact on the strategic picture. We did a show with Nicholas Young a few weeks ago. His father was part of the raid in the commandos, and he had been in an infantry regiment, then joins the commandos, and he leaves the commandos after this raid. And Nicholas isn't really sure why his father went back, because I think he dropped a rank to go back into the infantry, Beds and Hearts regiment, to go, and ended up serving in North Africa. And he's not sure why. And he was an officer. So did he leave this raid leave it thinking that there was a bad taste in his mouth about it? I don't know, but it's interesting that a commando officer said, "Yeah, I'm going to go back in infantry." So yeah. A thing can be more than one thing at the same time.
It can, but remember at this time as well, there's sort of lots of shuffling about, of the commando forces. They're still sort of getting their organisation and structure together at this point in time. So there were personnel being shifted around, quite a lot, and that might be part of the answer as well.
And as you said, they needed that success. So Andreas asked, "Are you part of the local tourist board?" Which is, are you being paid?
No, I'm not.
No, not yet. No, not yet.
Not yet. No, yeah. But yeah, you've got to go there. Get yourselves there. It's absolutely fantastic. But do not go in the summer because it is absolutely rammed with camper vans and tourists. And since Instagram, it's become like one of the go-to destinations. So I highly recommend that you go in winter. There is nobody there, and it is absolutely spectacular. It is gorgeous.
Brilliant. So Capo asked about, did the Reprisals pacify the Norwegians or make them more defiant? And this sort of came up with some of the other Norwegian experts a couple of weeks ago, is that they're in a country like Norway, where the occupation is long, there's sometimes like a trickle effect in that the immediate response isn't quite there because they don't have the resources, they don't have the organization. But you see a gradual building of confidence, and especially as the war starts gradually turning in the Allies' favor, 42, 43, you see these resistance activities and the defiance gradually build. But do you think at the time it had a particular effect on the locals? I mean, obviously, it's, you know, right beside where the raid was, there was that impact economically. As you said, the young men have gone, but across Norway.
Yeah, I think it really differs from individual to individual. I think some people were quite antagonistic towards the British. You know, that they felt that they'd sort of, I don't know, opened a can of worms, if you like, and, you know, and created lots of problems for the local Norwegian population, and then just buggered off again, as they were wont to do. Others thought it was, you know, the best thing, sliced bread, or, you know, were really, really grateful that, you know, the British have come and have done something, and, you know, and have tried to help us, kind of thing. But yeah, I think one of the things that I touch on in the book is the kind of gradual growth of the resistance movement within Germany, within Norway, sorry, and how that sort of begins to sort of coalesce and become more organized. I mean, the time that we're talking about, the invasion is only, and the occupation is only 10 months old. You know, it's still very, very early days. And I think for some people, it absolutely did encourage them to resist and encourage their opposition, and others, I think it may well have had the opposite effect. I really don't think you can generalize it. I think that the whole sort of concept of resistance and what resistance actually means is a very, very personal thing. And
I think that's why, you know, when we've often talked about it here, is that we as Brits, our country was never occupied, so we can look at it perhaps in a less nuanced way than the people from France or Norway or Denmark who were occupied, who had to their decision making process sort of evolved during the occupation. And I think that's it. I mean, and just to add a couple of things from David O'Keefe said, we talked about, you know, what strategic effect he had, and he was adding about the 3-rotor machine. When he said,
that's massive. That's massive.
You broke naval enigma and swung the entire tide of the Battle of Atlantic for nearly a year as a result. That's a massive strategic impact. So there's a larger impact from the raid that isn't necessarily being felt by the local Norwegian fishermen, but it is there. And then David Mendel say, Jane and I need to go and hammer out our argument on site. So I think
that's an excellent idea.
I think he's angling for an invitation to stay with you over there, and then you can sit in the evenings looking at the Northern Lights, debating whether or not it was a priority pinch raid or an accidental one. And I think if you do that, promise to video it so we can all watch it.
Absolutely. You're most welcome to come and stay with us anytime, David.
Anytime. And Ian is asking, was the fishing industry and storage tanks, were they rebuilt during the war?
Mostly they were.
Well,
they had to be, because, you know, they were essential for the functioning and the livelihood of the local people.
And that's the thing again about any kind of hit and run raid, and I'm talking about anything from this to sort of the blowing up bridges by air power in 43, 44, is that you very rarely put something out of action forever. What you're doing is you're putting it out of action for a length of time before the enemy has a time to rebuild it. So bridges or factories or whatever it be. It's never you've knocked it down completely. It's a hit. And the same thing is happening with the Axis bombing the Allies. It's a hit that the Allies then have to respond to and rebuild factories, rebuild this. So it's none of these events in 41, 42 have a knockout blow. They are, well, very rarely they do.
Well, I mean, we're not talking about large industrial complexes here either. We're talking about, you know, small port facilities, you know, harborside facilities, a couple of big oil store. You know, the mid lots of smoke. Yes, they did, you know, a fair bit of damage, but in the overall scheme of things, it's not achieving a great deal. in terms of the actual strike on the oil targets and things themselves. It's a spectacular rather than a long-term result, shall we say.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And the stay of David O'Keefe, they're talking about who's making the chowder now, so it's got into the details of the food. So your other half, Panny, has volunteered that, so take him up on that. So I wish I could be there for the chowder and the discussions, but I don't actually like chowder.
You're most welcome anytime. Yeah.
Well, Jane, we'll leave things there, and as always, we look forward to having you back on again. And thank you for you and James having me on. Never mind the damn buses, and of course, I put the link to their podcast in the description below and Jane's website if you haven't been there before. And of course, you can go back and find her previous appearances on the channel when we talked about Bomber Command. Your nearly day job. You have a real day job, then you have Bomber
Command. A real day job, unfortunately.
And then Norway is now a subsidiary job. It's you're spreading yourself too thin. Anyway,
not enough hours in the day. Yeah,
indeed. We're back again tomorrow talking about the Norwegian volunteers who served the American Army, skiing up in the north part of the USA. Looking forward to that. And I will see you all again tomorrow. So as always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, consider becoming a patron, and consider becoming a YouTube channel member. But I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.